When independence came with an invisible cost, freedom arrived without chains, parades, or clear warnings. The flags changed, the speeches ended, and the world moved on. But the price of independence had only just begun. This story matters today because independence is often treated as an ending, when in reality it is a beginning filled with hidden obligations, compromises, and pressures that rarely appear in official history. The moment of liberation is celebrated, but the decades of navigating its consequences are endured in relative silence, shaped by forces that most citizens never see. At the moment independence was declared, celebration overshadowed complexity, as leaders promised self-determination, control, and a future finally shaped from within rather than imposed from outside. What few acknowledged was how deeply the former system still influenced economics, institutions, and global relationships, binding the new nation to structures it had not designed. The administrative frameworks, trade agreements, legal precedents, and economic dependencies that had been built under foreign rule did not vanish with the declaration of sovereignty. They persisted, embedded in the machinery of governance, and every attempt to replace them revealed how thoroughly they have been woven into the fabric of national life. Political freedom came faster than economic independence, leaving the country responsible for decisions without the leverage to enforce them. Leaders could now set policy, but the markets, supply chains, and financial systems that determined whether those policies succeeded remained largely outside their control. International recognition brought legitimacy, but also expectations, debt, and dependency that quietly replaced direct control with subtler forms of influence. The terms of recognition were not gifts. They came attached to agreements, conditions, and relationships that limited maneuverability in ways that formal colonialism had once imposed openly. At first, progress felt real. Symbols mattered. Identities strengthened, and the population embraced the idea of sovereignty with hope rather than doubt. Yet beneath the surface, constraints remained, shaping choices long after independence was celebrated. The currency was vulnerable. The military was dependent on foreign equipment and training. The economy relied on exports whose prices were set by markets the nation could not influence. Each of these dependencies represented a thread of control that had not been severed by the transfer of political power. This was the invisible cost, not imposed by force, but inherited through transition, and it would define the nation's future more than anyone expected. As the early years unfolded, the gap between political sovereignty and practical control became harder to ignore as inherited systems limited how much the new nation could actually change. Economic structures remained tied to old trade patterns, forcing dependence on external markets while restricting diversification and growth. The crops that had been cultivated for export under colonial rule continued to dominate agriculture, not because they served the population's needs, but because they were what the existing infrastructure was designed to produce and what international buyers expected to receive. Institutions built under former rule struggled to adapt, carrying assumptions, hierarchies, and inefficiencies that no longer fit a self-governing society. Courts applied legal frameworks drafted by foreign administrators. Bureaucracies followed procedures designed for extraction rather than development. Education systems produced graduates trained for roles that served the old order rather than the new one. International partnerships offered support, but often came with conditions that shaped policy from afar, replacing direct rule with negotiated influence. Aid was not unconditional. Loans carried requirements for fiscal policy, trade liberalization, and institutional reforms that limited the new government's ability to chart its own course, even when that course might have better served its population. Public expectations rose faster than capacity, creating frustration as independence promised transformation while reality delivered constraint. Citizens who had imagined sovereignty as the beginning of prosperity found instead that freedom brought responsibility without the resources to fulfill it, and the disappointment fed political instability that further weakened the nation's capacity to build. Leaders faced pressure to perform sovereignty without the tools to fully exercise it, navigating symbolism while managing practical limitations. Every decision was watched by domestic audiences expecting rapid change and by international actors expecting predictable compliance, and satisfying both was often impossible. Progress continued, but unevenly, revealing that freedom alone does not guarantee autonomy. The nation was free in name, but still negotiating the boundaries of its power. and those boundaries were tighter than anyone had imagined. The conflict deepened as dependence began to shape identity, influencing how the nation saw itself and how others perceived its role in the world. Attempts to break free from inherited constraints carried risk, as sudden change threatened economic stability and international relationships. Leaders who pursued aggressive reform found that markets punished independence of thought as quickly as they had once punished colonial resistance, withdrawing investment, devaluing currency, and isolating governments that strayed too far from expectations. Internally, debates intensified between gradual reform and radical departure, each carrying potential cost. Those who advocated patience were accused of perpetuating dependence. Those who demanded rapid transformation were warned that disruption could erase the fragile gains independence had delivered. The middle ground was narrow, constantly shifting, and deeply unsatisfying to a population that had been promised more. External pressure increased as global institutions and powerful partners expected predictability rather than experimentation. The rules of the international system had been written before this nation had a voice, and participating in that system required accepting frameworks that had not been designed with its interests in mind. The buildup reached its peak when a major crisis exposed how limited sovereignty remained, forcing leaders to choose between autonomy and stability. The crisis revealed that the nation's ability to respond independently was constrained not by lack of will, but by the structural dependencies that independence had failed to dismantle. What independence had promised symbolically was now tested materially, revealing the tension between freedom and responsibility. The nation faced a reality that political control without economic leverage is fragile. Independence had removed one form of control, but replaced it with another less visible one. The chains had not been eliminated. They had been refinanced, restructured, and renamed, but their weight was no less real for being invisible. This was the moment when freedom felt incomplete, demanding choices that carried no perfect outcome. The climax arrived when the nation openly confronted the invisible costs it had long avoided naming, recognizing that independence without capacity limits choice as much as enables it. Freedom had been real, but constrained, shaped by forces that operated quietly beyond borders. The resolution lies in understanding that sovereignty is not a single event, but an ongoing process of building institutions, resilience, and leverage over time. True independence requires more than declaration. It demands patient strategy and adaptation. Each generation must earn its autonomy anew, not through a single act of liberation, but through the daily work of strengthening the systems that make self-determination possible. This story matters today because many nations continue to celebrate political milestones while underestimating the work required to sustain autonomy in a connected world. History shows that freedom is maintained through participation, not isolation. Independence is not diminished by acknowledging its cost, but strengthened by confronting it honestly. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When